Chapter 6. Justinian, continued, 545–65 AD by Charles Oman. Justinian as builder, his ruinous financial policy, his Second Persian War, Chosroes takes Antioch, 540, campaigns of Belisarius and Chosroes, the Great Plague of 542, peace with Persia, Baduila restores the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, his campaign against Belisarius, two sieges of Rome, success. In greatness of Baduila, Narses invades Italy, Baduila slain at Tagini, 552, end of the Ostrogothic kingdom, Narses defeats the Franks. Justinian attacks southern Spain, Third Persian War, 549–55, Justinian as theologian, Belisarius defeats the Huns, later years of Justinian, his legal reforms. The year 540 was the last of Justinian's years of unbroken good fortune. For the rest of his long life, he was to experience many vicissitudes and see some of his dearest schemes frustrated, though on the whole, the dogged perseverance, which was his most notable characteristic, brought him safely through to the end. The first difficulty which was destined to trouble him in the latter half of his reign was a financial one. He had now come to the end of the hoarded wealth of Anastasius. The military budget of his increased empire required more money, for Africa and Italy did not pay their way, and now a new Persian war was upon his hands. Justinian as builder. In addition, his magnificent court and his insatiable thirst for building called for huge sums year after year. It is impossible to exaggerate Justinian's expenditure on bricks and mortar. Not only did he rebuild in his capital on a more magnificent scale all the public edifices that had been burnt in the Nika riot, but he filled every corner of his empire from newly conquered Ravenna to the Armenian frontier with splendid forts, churches, monasteries, hospitals, and aqueducts. Whenever a Byzantine ruin is found in the wilds of Syria or Asia Minor, it turns out, in one case out of every two, to be of Justinian's date. In the Balkan Peninsula alone, we learn to our surprise that he erected more than 300 forts and castles to defend the line of the Danube and the Haemus, the side of the empire which had been found most open to attacks of the barbarian during the last century. The building of his enormous cathedral of St. Sophia alone cost several millions, an expenditure whose magnificent result quite justifies itself, but one which must have seemed heartrending to the financiers who had to find the money at a moment when the emperor was involved in two desperate wars. Justinian poured forth his treasures with unstinting hand in the arts both of war and of peace, but to replenish his treasury, that jar of the Danaids, he had to impose a crushing taxation on the empire. His finance minister, John of Cappadocia, was the most unscrupulous of men, one who never shrank from plying extortion of every kind upon the wretched taxpayers. As long as he kept the exchequer full, Justinian winked at his iniquitous and often illegal proceedings. It was only when he chanced to quarrel with the Empress Theodora that John was finally disgraced. Ruinous finance of Justinian. His successors were less capable, but no less extortionate. Ere 10 years had passed, the Africans and Italians, groaning under the yoke of the Greek logothetes, were cursing their stars that ever they had aided Belisarius to drive out the Arian Goth and Vandal. As Justinian's reign went on, the state of matters grew worse and worse, for a crushing taxation tends to drain the resources of the land, and at last renders it unable to bear even a burden that would have once been light. Historians recapitulate 20 new taxes that Justinian laid upon the empire, yet at the end of his reign they were bringing in far less than the old and simpler imposts of Anastasius and Justin had produced. This ruinous draining of the vital power of the empire only began to be seriously felt after 540, when, for the first time, Justinian was compelled to wage war at once in East and West, and yet refused to slacken from his building. The Gothic War, contrary to all probability and expectation, was still destined to run on for 13 years more. The Persian lasted for 16, and when they were over, the emperor and the empire alike were but the shadow of their former selves. They were unconquered, but drained of all their strength and marrow. The Perso-Roman frontier under Justinian. We have already mentioned that the young King Chosroes of Persia, stirred up by the embassy of Witigis and dreading lest the power which had subdued Carthage and Rome should ere long stretch out its hand to Ctesiphon, had found a casus belli and crossed the Mesopotamian frontier. Some blood feuds between Arab hordes respectively subject to Persia and Constantinople, and a dispute about the suzerainty of some tribes in the Armenian highlands formed a good enough excuse for renewing the war at a moment when Justinian's best general and zero of the flower of his troops were absent in Italy and Africa. Second Persian War, 545–45. In the spring of 540, at the very moment when Belisarius was reducing Ravenna, Chosroes marched up the Euphrates, leaving the frontier fortresses of Daras and Edessa on his flank, and launched a sudden attack on North Syria. He had been expected not there, but in Mesopotamia, and all preparations for defense were out of gear. Before any resistance was organized, Chosroes had crossed the Euphrates, sacked Berea, and ransomed Hierapolis for £2,000 of gold. But it was at Antioch, the third city of the Roman Empire, and the seat of the Praetorian prefect of the East, that the Persian monarch was aiming. It was more than 2 centuries and a half since the city of the Orontes had seen a foreign foe, and its walls were old and dilapidated. A garrison of 6,000 men was thrown in, and the blues and greens of the city armed themselves to guard the ramparts. Sack of Antioch, 540. But there was no Roman army in the field to protect the city from the approach of the Persian. Buses, the general of the East, refused to risk his small army in a general engagement, and had retired no one knew whither. The siege of Antioch was short, for the defense was ill-managed. The garrison cut its way out when the walls were forced, but the town, with all its wealth and a great number of its inhabitants who had not found time to fly, became the prize of Chosroes. The Persian plundered the churches, burnt the private houses, and drove away a herd of captives, whom he took to his home and established in a new city near Ctesiphon, which he called Chosrontiochia. The great king then ransomed the neighboring cities of Chalcis and Apamea and recrossed the Euphrates into Mesopotamia. Here, where strong and well-armed fortresses blocked his way, Chosroes found that he could effect nothing. After looking at Edessa, he found it too strong and made his way to Daras. To this town he laid siege, but was beaten off without much difficulty, and then returned home for the winter 540. The Persians were never destined to win again such successes as had fallen to them in this, the first year of the war. By the next spring, Justinian had reinforced the eastern frontier with all his disposable troops, and the mighty Belisarius himself had arrived to take command of the army of Mesopotamia. But it was not fated that the great king and the great captain should ever measure themselves against each other. Hearing that the frontier to the south was now well guarded, the Persian had resolved to make a dash at a new point of the Roman line of defense. While expected on the Euphrates, he quietly marched north through the Median and Iberian mountains, crossed many obscure passes, and appeared on the Black Sea coast by the river Phasis. The Romans here held the shore by their great castle of Petra, while the Lazi, the tribes of inland Colchis, were Roman vassals. Chosroes overran the land, constrained the Lazi to do him homage, and after a short siege, took Petra. Meanwhile Belisarius, on finding the Persian invasion of Mesopotamia delayed, had crossed the frontier in the far south, beaten a small Persian force in the field, and ravaged Assyria from end to end, though he could not take the great fortress of Nisibis. On hearing of this raid, Chosroes returned from Colchis with his main army, whereupon Belisarius retired behind the ramparts of Daras. The campaign had not been eventful, but the balance of gain lay on the side of the Persians, whose frontier now touched the Black Sea. Nor was the next year, 542, destined to see any decisive fighting. Belisarius had concentrated his army at Europus on the Euphrates and waited to be attacked, but save one raid no attack came, though Chosroes had brought the full force of his empire up to Nisibis. The Roman chronicles ascribe his sluggishness to a fear of the reputation of Belisarius, but another cause seems to have been more operative. The Great Plague of 542 had just broken out in Persia, and its ravages were probably the real cause of the retreat and disbanding of the army of Chosroes, much as in 1348 the Black Death caused English and French to drop for a time their mutual hostilities. This awful scourge merits a word of notice. It broke out in Egypt early in the year and spread like wildfire over Syria, the lands of the Euphrates Valley, and Asia Minor, thence making its way to Constantinople and the West. It is impossible to make out its exact nature, but we know that it was accompanied by ulcers and by a horrible swelling of the groin. The Great Plague of 542. Few whom it struck down ever recovered, but of these few was Justinian himself, who rose from his bed when the rumor of his death was already abroad and a fight for the succession imminent. At Constantinople, the plague raged with such violence that 5,000 and even 10,000 persons are said to have died in a single day. The historian Procopius marveled at its universal spread. A man might climb to the top of a hill, and it was there, or retire to the depths of a cavern, but it was there also. It took no note of north or south, Greek or Persian, washed or unwashed, winter or summer. In all alike it was deadly. This awful scourge, which is thought to have carried off a third of the population of the empire, was not the least of the causes of that general decay which is found in the later years of Justinian's reign. It swept away taxpayers, brought commerce to a standstill, and seems to have left the emperor himself an old man before his time. The plague then sufficiently accounts for the stagnation of the war in 542. Perhaps we may also allow something for the personal troubles of Belisarius, who, in the previous winter, had fallen on evil times. He had detected his intriguing wife Antonina in unfaithfulness, and for throwing her into a dungeon and kidnapping her paramour, had incurred the wrath of Theodora, which seriously handicapped him in the rest of his career, so great was her influence with her imperial spouse. He was no longer supported from Constantinople as he had once been, and was at last compelled to disarm Theodora's displeasure by liberating his wife. The imperial ill-humor may, perhaps, have stinted his resources during the summer that followed his domestic misfortune. In 543, the plague having somewhat abated, Chosroes once more assumed the offensive and moved towards Roman Armenia, following the valley of the upper Euphrates. But a fresh outbreak of pestilence forced him to turn back, and the Romans were consequently enabled to invade Persarmenia. Belisarius was not with them, and they suffered a serious defeat from an inferior force and returned with discredit to their old cantonments. The great general had been recalled with ignominy to Constantinople. Justinian had heard that, when the news of his supposed death had reached the army of the Euphrates, Belisarius had shown some signs of arranging for a military pronunciamento. He did not make this his pretext for recall, but dwelt on some unsettled charges of money lost from the Vandal and Gothic treasures, for which there was some foundation, for Belisarius, like Marlborough, had an unhappy taste for hoarding. For some months the general was in disgrace. His bodyguard was dispersed, 7,000 men was too large a comitatus for even the most loyal of men, and much of his wealth confiscated, but, on his consenting to be reconciled to his wife, and to depart for Italy, the Empress Theodora consented to forget her displeasure and allow Justinian to give Belisarius the charge of a new war, 543. But before relating the doings of the humbled and heartbroken Belisarius in the West, we must finish the Persian War. In 544 Chosroes, freed alike from the plague and from the fear of Belisarius, invaded Mesopotamia and laid siege to its capital Edessa. After a siege of many months, in which the gallant garrison beat off every effort both of open force and of military engineerings, mounds, mines, rams, and towers availed nothing against them, Chosroes withdrew humbled to Nisibis and began to negotiate for a truce. It was successfully made on the terms that the Persians should retain the homage of their conquests in Colchis and receive 2,000 pounds of gold on evacuating their other conquests, which were of small value. On the all-important Mesopotamian frontier, the great fortresses had held good, and there was nothing of importance for the king to restore. This truce was concluded for 5 years, at the end of which the war was renewed, 545–550. Meanwhile all Italy was once more aflame with war. After Ravenna surrendered and Witiges was led captive to Byzantium, all the Gothic fortresses surrendered save 2, Verona and Pavia, the only towns of northern Italy in which the Teutonic element seems to have outnumbered the Roman. Hildebald, king of the Goths, 540–41. The remnant of the Ostrogoths in Pavia, though they did not number 2,000 men, took the bold step of proclaiming a new king, a warrior named Hildebald, who was the nephew of Theudes, king of Spain, and who promised his uncle's help to his followers. Hildebald's resistance might have been crushed if he had been promptly attacked, but the Roman commanders were occupied in taking over the towns that made no resistance and in quelling some disorders among their own men. After Belisarius left, there were 5 generals in the peninsula of whom none was trusted with supreme authority over the rest. Each left to another the task of treading out the last sparks of Gothic resistance, and gradually Hildebald grew stronger as the scattered remnants of the army of Witigis made their way to his camp. When he recovered most of Venetia, the Romans thought him worthy of notice, but he won a battle near Trevise over the army that came against him. The Italians were now far from showing the devotion to the imperial cause that they had once displayed. The Logothetes from Constantinople were harassing them with new imposts, and most especially with the preposterous attempt to gather the arrears of taxation for the years during which the war had raged, a time at which the emperor had, as a matter of fact, no firm hold on the country. In 540, one Hildebald was murdered by a private enemy heir, yet he had succeeded in freeing all the land north of the Po. But this hero of the darkest hour, who had saved the Goths from extinction when salvation seemed impossible, found a still worthier successor. After a few months, during which a certain Rugian named Eraric ruled at Pavia, Hildebald's nephew Baduila was raised on the shield and saluted as king. Baduila was, after Theodoric, the greatest of all the Goths of East or West. He showed a moral elevation, a single-hearted purity of purpose, a chivalrous courtesy, a justice and piety worthy of the best of the knights of the Middle Ages. As a warrior, his feats were astonishing. He outgeneraled even the great Belisarius himself. The only stain on his character during 11 years of rule are 1 or 2 unjustifiable executions of prisoners of war who had roused his wrath and caused the old Gothic fury to blaze forth. From the first moment of his accession, Baduila went forth conquering and to conquer. Baduila, king of the Goths, 541–53. The Roman generals, frightened by his first successes, were at last induced to combine. He foiled them at Verona, followed them across the Po, and inflicted on them at Faenza in Aemilia a decisive defeat in the open field, though they had 0 men to his 5,000. Then, crossing the Apennines, he won all Tuscany by a second battle on the Mugello near Florence. By these 2 victories, all Italy north of Rome, save the great fortresses, fell into his hands. Rome and Ravenna, with Piacenza in the valley of the Po, and Ancona and Perugia in the center, were left as isolated garrisons, rising above the returning tide of Gothic conquest. All the surviving Goths had rallied under Baduila's banner, and many of the imperial mercenaries of Teutonic blood took service with him when the cities which they garrisoned were subdued. After conquering Tuscany and Picenum, Baduila left Rome to itself for a space. The memories of its last siege were too discouraging, and spent the year 542 in overrunning Campania and Apulia. The Italians kept apathetically quiet, while the imperial garrisons were few and scattered. In 6 months, South Italy was once more Gothic up to the gates of Otranto, Reggio, and Naples. The siege of the last-named town was Baduila's first exercise in politicks. The place was very gallantly defended, and only surrendered when famine had done its work, and after an armament sent from Constantinople to its relief had been shattered by a storm almost in sight of the walls, along the rocks of Capri and Sorrento. In spite of this desperate resistance, it was noted with surprise that Baduila treated both garrison and people with kindness, sending the one away unharmed and preserving the other from plunder. It was at the time of the fall of Naples that an event occurred which was long remembered as a token of the justice of Baduila. A Gothic warrior had violated the daughter of a Calabrian. The king cast the man into bonds and ordered his death, but many of the Goths besought him not to slay a brave warrior for such an offense. Baduila heard them out and replied that they must choose that day whether they preferred to save one man's life or to save the whole Gothic nation. At the beginning of the war, they would remember how they had great hosts, famous generals, vast treasure, splendid arms, and all the castles of Italy. But under King Theodahat, a man who loved gold better than justice, they had so moved God's anger by their unrighteous lives that everything had been taken from them. But the divine grace had given the Goths one more chance of working out their salvation. God had opened a new account with them, and so must they do with him, by following justice and righteousness. The ravisher must die, and as to being a brave warrior, they should remember that the cruel and unjust were never finally successful in war, for as was a man's life, such was his fortune in battle. The officers caught their sovereign's meaning and withdrew, and the criminal was duly executed. In 542, the year of the plague, Justinian had been able to do little for Italy, but in that which followed, when he heard that Naples had fallen, he determined to send the newly pardoned Belisarius back to the scene of his former glories. Denied the services of his own bodyguard, the great general recruited raw troops in Thrace and made ready to return. Baduila meanwhile was besieging Otranto and clearing Apulia of the imperialists. In the next year, the Gothic king and the Roman general came for the first time into contact. Contrary to expectation, it was not Belisarius who had the better of the struggle. Broken in spirit, badly served by his raw recruits, and by the demoralized army of Italy, and unaided by Justinian, who was straining every nerve to keep up the Persian War, he accomplished little or nothing. Campaign of Belisarius and Baduila. Based on the impregnable fortress of Ravenna, he was able to seize Pesaro and to relieve the garrisons of Osimo and of Otranto, but that was all. Baduila ravaged Italy unmolested and began to make preparations for the siege of Rome. If he was to be checked, as Belisarius wrote to his master, more men and money to pay them were urgently needed. Justinian could not, or would not, send either men or money in adequate quantity, and Baduila was able to invest Rome. Unlike Witiges, he succeeded in barring all the roads and in blocking the Tiber by a boom of spars. Famine was soon within the walls, but the Goths made no attempt at a storm, leaving hunger to do its work. Bessus, the governor of Rome, sought for aid from all sides, and corn ships were sent him from Sicily, but Baduila seized them all as they were tacking up the Tiber channel. Then Belisarius came round to Portus, at the mouth of the river, with all the men he could muster, a very few thousands, and endeavored to force his way to Rome by breaking Baduila's boom and bringing his lighter war vessels up the Tiber. He left his wife, his stores, and his reserves at Portus, sailed up the river, and succeeded, after a hot engagement, in burning the towers which guarded the boom. But in the moment of success, news came to him that the Goths were attacking Portus in his rear, and that his wife and camp were in danger. He turned back, found that the fighting at Portus was only an insignificant skirmish brought on by the rashness of the officer in command there, and so missed his chance of forcing the boom. Disappointment, or the malarial fever of the marshy Tiber mouth, laid him on a bed of sickness next day, and before he was recovered, Rome had fallen. Some of the famished garrison threw open the Asinarian gate at midnight and admitted the Goths, after the siege had lasted 13 months, 545–546. The blame of the fall of the city rested mainly on the governor Bessus, who doled out his stores with a sparing hand to soldiery and people alike, while he was secretly selling the corn at exorbitant prices to the richer citizens. The troops were starving, yet vast quantities of provisions were found concealed in the general's praetorium. Baduila gave up the plunder of the city to his long-tried troops, but sternly prohibited murder, rape, or violence. Baduila takes Rome, 546. By the confession of his enemies themselves, only 26 Romans lost their lives, though 20,000 war-worn troops had poured into the city at midnight, wild for plunder and revenge. The king made the churches into sanctuaries, and the multitudes that gathered in them suffered no harm. Baduila looked upon Rome as the chief lair of his enemies, the home of a faithless people and the snare of the Goths. He resolved neither to make it his capital nor to garrison it, but to make a desert of it. The people were driven out, the gates burnt, and great breaches were made all round the walls of Aurelian. Then he harangued his army, bidding them remember how, in the days of Witiges, 7,000 imperialists had robbed of power and wealth, and liberty 100,000 rich and well-armed Goths. But now that the Goths were become poor, and few, and war-worn, they had discomfited more than 20,000 Greeks. The reason was that in the old days they had angered God by their pride and evil living. Now they were humbled and chastened in spirit, and therefore they were victorious. For the future they must remember that if just they would have God with them, but if they fell back into their former ways, the hand of heaven would work their downfall. This done, he drew off with his army, leaving Rome desolate, and without a living soul within its walls. For 40 days the imperial city was given up to the wolf and the owl, but at last Belisarius, who still lay at Portus with his small army, marched within the walls, hurriedly barricaded the breaches and the gateless portals, and prepared to hold Rome for a third siege. The Goths had been too slack in casting down the walls, and the hasty repairs of Belisarius made the city once more tenable against any coup de main. Belisarius recovers Rome. In great disgust, Baduila rushed back from Campania and tried to force the barricades. After 3 assaults, he recognized that they were too strong and retired to central Italy, leaving, however, a strong corps of observation at Tivoli to keep Belisarius from issuing out of the city for further operations. For 2 years more Belisarius and Baduila fought up and down the peninsula, but the Goth kept the superiority. Though sometimes foiled, he had, on the whole, the advantage. Belisarius, like Hannibal during the later years of his sojourn in Italy, flitted from point to point with his small army, looking for opportunities to strike a blow, but seldom finding them. Justinian, though now freed from the Persian War, sent no adequate supplies or reinforcements, and seemed content that his general should hold no more than Rome and Ravenna. In 548 Belisarius was recalled on his own or his wife's request. He felt that he could do no more with his inadequate resources. He had outlived the desire of glory, and his old age was at hand. Justinian received him with kindness, made him Magister Militum and chief of the imperial guard, and bade him live in peace in Constantinople. The sole check on Baduila was now removed, and in the 4 years that followed, the gallant Goth cleared the whole country, save Ravenna, of the presence of the imperialist soldiery. He retook Rome in 549 and captured or slew the whole garrison. This time, instead of dismantling the city, he determined to make it his capital. Successes of Baduila. He reorganized the Senate, bade the palace be repaired, and celebrated games in the circus, as his great predecessor, Theodoric, had done. It would seem that he now felt himself so strong that he feared no return of the imperialist armies, and lost his old dread of walled towns. He sent embassies to Justinian, bidding the emperor recognize accomplished facts and return to the old relations that had subsisted between the Goths and the emperor in the happy days of Anastasius and Theodoric. But the stern ruler of the East was immovable. He quietly persisted in the war and merely began to collect once more an army for the invasion of Italy. The first expedition he placed under Count Germanus, his own nephew, who was looked upon as the destined heir to the empire. But a sudden invasion of Macedonia by the Slavs drew aside Germanus to Thessalonica. He achieved a success over the invaders, but died soon after, and his army never crossed the Adriatic. Baduila, meanwhile, was in full possession of Italy. When he found that the armament of Germanus had dispersed, he built a fleet, conquered Sardinia, and then crossed into Sicily and ravaged that island, against whose people the Goths bore an especial grudge for their rebellion and eager reception of Belisarius 15 years before. It was not that Baduila was forced to fight on the defensive once more and protect Italy from the last of the armies of Justinian. Narses invades Italy, 552. This time the emperor had chosen a strange commander-in-chief, the eunuch Narses, his chamberlain or prepositus sacri cubiculi, who had once before been seen in Italy in 538 when he had intrigued against Belisarius. Narses was known as clever, pushing, and persistent, but his choice as a general-in-chief was one of those strange appointments of Justinian, which looked like freaks of folly, but turned out to have been guided by the deepest knowledge of character. Being better trusted than Belisarius, he was better equipped for war. Besides a large detachment of the regular troops of the East, he was allowed to hire no less than 10,000 German auxiliaries from the Danube, Herulls, Lombards, and Gepidae. His whole force must have been more than 20,000 strong, thrice the size of the army that had followed Belisarius. Narses had resolved to turn the head of the Adriatic and advance through Venetia, but while he was executing this long march, he sent a fleet to threaten the east coast of Italy. Off Ancona, his armada met and defeated the Gothic ships, which Baduila had brought round to watch the Adriatic. This engagement seems to have induced the Goths to expect a Roman landing in Picenum, and only a small portion of Baduila's army was sent into Venetia under Count Tea to watch the passes of the Carnic Alps. Narses succeeded in eluding this force by hugging the sea coast and using his ships to ferry him over the Po mouth. He reached Ravenna without striking a blow, and there was joined by such Roman troops as were already in Italy. Then, neglecting all the Gothic fortresses, he marched straight on Rome, not by the Flaminian Way, the great road between north and south, for that was held by the Goths, but by following a minor pass up the valley of the river Sena. He had just crossed the Apennines when Baduila met him at Tagini, in Umbria, under the very shadow of the mountains. The Gothic king had called up all his forces from central Italy and was joined by Tea and the northern army on the eve of the fight, but he was still inferior in numbers to the imperialists. Narses showed himself an able general. Knowing that the Goths mainly trusted to the wild rush of their heavy cavalry, he dismounted all his barbarian auxiliaries and formed them in a serried mass in his center. 8,000 Roman archers flanked them, and chosen Roman cavalry were held in reserve on his left wing. Baduila bade his men use the lance alone, and himself led the horsemen of his comitatus in a gallant charge on the enemy's center. Battle of Tagini. From noon till dusk, the Gothic knights dashed again and again at the phalanx in the middle of the Roman line. They could not break it, and meanwhile they were shot down in hundreds by the archers on the wings. The battle, in fact, was much like the English fight at Crecy. At both the archery and dismounted horsemen beat back the unsupported cavalry of the assailant. At last, towards dusk, the wrecks of the Gothic cavalry reeled back in disorder upon their infantry, and Narses bade the 1,500 cuirassiers of his reserve to strike at the hostile flank. All was over with the Goths. Their line broke and fled, their gallant king was mortally wounded in the pursuit, and darkness alone saved the army from annihilation. So perished Baduila, last Ostrogothic king of Italy and first of the knights of the Middle Ages, as he has been not inaptly styled. There was still, however, fighting to be done. The warriors who had escaped from Tagini proclaimed Count Tea king, and though most of the Italian towns accepted the death of Baduila as ending the war, a few still held out. Rome, manned by an inadequate garrison, was stormed with ease, and its kais sent, now for the third time, to Justinian. King Tea, after ranging up and down the land, in a vain attempt to keep up the war, was brought to bay in Campania. His little army, penned up in the hills above Sorrento, made a sudden dash to catch the eunuch general unprepared. The Goths leave Italy 553, but Narses was ready for them, and on the banks of the Sarno, the last of the Goths were overwhelmed with numbers and saw their king slain in the forefront of the battle. Then the poor remnants of the rulers of Italy sent to offer submission. They would leave the peninsula with bag and baggage, wife and child, and betake themselves beyond the Alps, if only a free passage were granted to them. So, in the autumn of 553, the few remaining Gothic garrisons laid down their arms, gathered together, and disappeared over the passes of the Alps into the northern darkness. We have no tidings of the fate of these last survivors of the great Ostrogothic race. Whether they became the vassals of the Frank, or mingled with the Bavarians, or sought their kinsmen, the Visigoths of Spain, no man can tell. So perished the Gothic kingdom, which had been erected by the genius of Theodoric, by the same fate which had smitten the pirate realm of the Vandals 17 years before. Both fell because the ruling race was too small to hold down the vast territory that it had overrun, unless it could combine frankly and freely with the conquered Roman population. Causes of Gothic disasters. But the fatal bar of Arianism lay in each case between masters and servants, and when the Orthodox armies of Constantinople appeared, nothing could restrain the Africans and Italians from opening their gates to the invader. The Ostrogoths had been wise and tolerant, the Vandals cruel and persecuting, but the end was the same in each kingdom. It was only in the measure of the resistance that the difference between Goth and Vandal appeared. Sunk in coarse luxury and enervated by the African sun, the Vandals fell in 1 year before a single army. The Ostrogoths, the noblest of the Teutons, made a splendid fight for 17 years, beat off the great Belisarius himself, and only succumbed because the incessant fighting had drained off the whole manhood of the tribe. If Baduila could have mustered at Tagini the 100,000 men that Witiges had once led against Rome, he would never have been beaten. It is one of the saddest scenes in history when we see the well-ordered realm of Theodoric vanish away, and Italy is left an unpeopled desert, to be disputed between the savage Lombard, the faithless Frank, and the exarchs of distant Byzantium. The conquest of Italy by Narses was destined to have one further episode ere it was yet complete. When Tea's fate was known, the ministers of the young Frankish king Theudebald of Metz launched a great army into the peninsula, under two Suabian dukes Clothar and Buxilin. Their hosts pressed down the peninsula, following the one the western coast, the other the eastern. But Clothar's army was destroyed by famine and pestilence, and Buxilin's was annihilated at Casilinum in Campania by Narses. Against the mass of Frankish foot soldiers, with spear and battle-axe, Narses employed the same tactics as against the Gothic horse. A solid center of dismounted Teutons, Lombards, and Heruli kept the Frankish column in check, while wings of Roman archers and cuirassiers swung round the flanks of the invader, enveloped him, and destroyed him. Of 40,000 of Buxilin's men, it is said that not 100 escaped, so far worse did they fare than the Goths had fared at Tagini in the previous year. Desolation in Italy. The Frankish ravages put the last finishing touch to the misery of Italy. Alike in the northern plain, in Picenum and Aemilia, and in the neighborhood of Rome, the whole population had disappeared. Justinian and Narses had restored peace, but it was the best example ever seen of the adage solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant. To these same years belongs the story of Justinian's invasion of southern Spain, an episode which will be found narrated at full length in the chapter dealing with the Visigoths. We must now turn back to Justinian's fortunes in the East. It will be remembered that his Second Persian War had been ended by a 5 years' truce in 545, after the Great Plague and gallant defense of Edessa. The 5 years of peace that followed were not very notable in the history of the empire save for one important event. Theodora, the colleague and other self of Justinian, died of cancer in 548, and with her death much of her husband's vigor, if not of his persistence, seems to have vanished. Deprived of his counselor and helpmate, the emperor became gloomy and morbid. His midnight studies took the direction of theology alone, and he launched out into a futile ecclesiastical controversy on the 3 chapters. This was a wholly unnecessary dispute as to whether 3 documents of 3 patristic writers, Theodore, Ebers, and Theodoret, all long dead, contained heretical matter or not. But it succeeded in convulsing the whole Eastern Church and led Justinian into a quarrel with the Roman See, which refused to condemn the 3 chapters. He seized Pope Vigilius and brought him to Constantinople to compel him to fall in with his own views. Justinian and Pope Vigilius. After detaining the unfortunate pontiff in the East for 6 years, and even dragging him from sanctuary and imprisoning him in an island, the emperor succeeded in inducing him to declare that Theodore and the 2 other theologians had indeed fallen into grievous heresy. Justinian was triumphant, but Vigilius found that he had thereby introduced schism into Italy and Africa, where many bishops stood by the 3 chapters. An African council went so far as to excommunicate Vigilius, and for a century some of the North Italian churches were out of communion with the Roman See. But long ere Vigilius had yielded, Justinian was once more at war with Persia. When the 5 years' truce ran out at the end of 549, the imperial troops advanced to recover the suzerainty of Colchis, the one point that had been yielded to Chosroes in the Treaty of 545. But strangely enough, while the war was renewed on the Black Sea, it did not recommence on the Mesopotamian frontier. Third Persian War, 549–55. Both parties concurred to renew the truce for everything except Colchis, and on that limited arena alone the hostilities proceeded. The struggle recalls, in this curious feature, the way in which the French and English fought in India in the 18th century, while in Europe they were at peace. Conditions of the war were favorable to Justinian, whose armies had free access by sea to the Colchian coast, while the Persians had to reach it by the wild passes over the Armenian and Iberian mountains. The dreary but very bloody Chalkic or Lazic War went on for 6 years, draining alike the Persian and the imperial treasuries, but at last the Romans had the better in the struggle, secured the homage of the Lazic king, and drove the Persians far back into the interior, 555. Finally, after interminable negotiations, Chosroes made peace, surrendering his claim on Colchis in consideration of an indemnity of 30,000 solidi, £18,000 per annum. This was the last of Justinian's great wars, but the end of his reign was far from being peaceful or prosperous. It was especially noteworthy for the repeated inroads of the Huns and Slavs into the Balkan Peninsula. The greatest raid was in 558, when the Kotriger Huns under their Khan Zabergan eluded the garrisons on the Danube, crossed the Balkans, and rode at large over the whole of Thrace. Belisarius defeats the Huns. One body of 4,000 horse pushed their incursions up to the very gates of Constantinople, and so alarmed Justinian that he bade the aged Belisarius to buckle on his arms once more and save the capital. The military resources of the empire were so scattered that Belisarius could only count on 300 of his own veterans, on the Scalarian guards, and a levy of half-armed Thracian rustics. By skillfully posting this small force and inducing the Huns to attack his line exactly where it was strongest, he routed the barbarians and returned in triumph from this, his last campaign. After this final feat of the old general, it is sad to learn that his master had not even yet learned to trust him. 4 years later, there was a futile conspiracy against Justinian, and Belisarius was accused of having known of it. He was disgraced and put under ward for 8 months, before the emperor convinced himself that the charge was false. Restored at last to favor, he lived 2 years more in possession of his riches and honors, and died in March 565. His thankless master followed him to the grave before the end of the same year. On the 11th of December 565, Justinian, after living more than 70 years and reigning for 38, descended to the tomb. We have spoken of Justinian's wars, of his buildings, of his financial policy, of his ecclesiastical controversies. But for none of these is he so well remembered as for his activity in yet another sphere: legal reforms of Justinian. It is by his great work of codifying the Roman law and leaving it in a complete and orderly form as a heritage to the jurists of the modern world that he earned his greatest title to immortality. This was an achievement of the first half of his reign, carried out with the aid of the best lawyers of Constantinople, headed by Tribonian, the able but greedy quaestor against whom the rioters in the Nika sedition had raged so furiously. Roman law had hitherto consisted of 2 elements: the constitutions and edicts of the emperors and the decisions of the great lawyers of the past. Both these elements were somewhat chaotic. 5 centuries of imperial edicts overruled and contradicted each other in the most hopeless confusion. Pagan and Christian ideas were intermixed in them, many had gone completely out of date, and new conditions of society had made others impossible to work. Nor were the responsa prudentum or decisions of the ancient jurisconsults any less chaotic. In modern England, the difficulties of case-made law, as it has been happily called, are perplexing enough to enable us to understand the troubles of a Constantinopolitan judge, confronted with a dozen precedents of contradictory import. Justinian removed all this confusion by producing 3 great works. His code collected the imperial constitutions into a manageable shape, striking out all the obsolete edicts and bringing the rest up to the requirements of a Christian state of the 6th century. His digest or Pandex did the same for the decisions of the ancient lawyers, laying down the balance of authority and specifying the precedents which were to be accepted. Lastly, the institutes gave a general sketch of Roman law in the form of a commentary on its principles for the use of students. These volumes were destined to be the foundation of all systematic jurisprudence in modern Europe. Their compilation was the last, and not the least, of the works of the ancient Roman spirit of law and order, incarnate in the last great emperor of Roman speech. For none of Justinian's successors could say, as could he himself, that Latin was his native tongue. After ages remembered him, above all things, as the compiler of the code, and it was as its framer that he is set by Dante in one of the starry thrones of the Christian paradise. In spite of all his great achievements, it cannot be disputed that Justinian left the empire weaker than he found it. Its territorial expansion in Italy, Africa, and Spain did not compensate for the exhaustion of the eastern provinces. By his ruthless taxation, Justinian had drained off their vital energies and left them poorer and weaker than they had ever been before. Even his armies felt the reaction. At the end of his reign, we read that they were sinking both in numbers and efficiency. The new and extended frontiers were more than they could guard, and the old race of generals who had followed Belisarius was dead. Justinian himself is said to have neglected their pay and maintenance, while he set his aged brains to wrestle with the problem of the 3 chapters or the heresy of orthodoxitism. Like Louis Roman XIV of France, whom he resembles in many other respects, Justinian closed a reign of unparalleled magnificence as a gloomy pietist, whose despotism drained and crushed a people who had grown to abhor his very name.